everyone. Welcome back to the Literacy Volunteers of Harrison County YouTube channel. Today we're going to look at the second part of a two-part series on the brain that my brother, Dr. Richard Suplita, has been talking about. We're going to start by looking at the forebrain today, and we would like to thank you all for looking at our channel, and please give us a thumbs up and subscribe.
Well, welcome back, and I'm honored again to be able to share a little information with you today. And so in the previous lesson we looked at some of the deeper brain structures from the spinal cord up through the hindbrain and then into the midbrain. What we want to focus on now is usually for most of my students in the past has been something that they were much more interested in learning about the forebrain. So these are some of the higher cognitive areas of the brain involved in things like sensation and perception and even things like psychology. And so we'll start here. Again, we're taking an inside-out approach or a bottom-up approach. And so we want to talk about three major functional areas of the forebrain or the telencephalon. So we'll talk a little bit about the basal ganglia. We'll talk about the limbic cortex and about the cerebral cortex, or the outermost part of the brain last. And so the way this is arranged, it's sort of like concentric circles, okay? And so the basal ganglia would not be on the surface of the brain. This is buried beneath the outer part of the cerebrum. There are subcortical structures, and there's a number of them. Just to keep it simple, I'm just referring to them collectively as the basal ganglia. And then outside of that, sort of above that, would be the limbic cortex. And then the outermost part of the brain would be the cerebrum. And so the basal ganglia is very critical for things like movement and motivation. So I put in parentheses there, motor, because the word motor refers to movement, but the word motivation starts with the same prefix. And so whether we're talking about actually moving our body or just the motivation to do certain types of behaviors, what we're looking at primarily is the basal ganglia, specifically the activity, again, of the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine is one of our primary movement neurotransmitters. Without dopamine functioning like it should, we would become statuesque. We would sort of freeze up, as in severe Parkinson's disease. But also it plays just as critical of a role in proper motivation. And so you see things like dysregulation of dopamine in conditions like, for example, major depressive disorder. Okay, so also dopamine, and also here focusing on the basal ganglia in terms of anatomy, plays a major role in drug addiction. I hope to do a subsequent video at some point on addiction. But what we see happening in addiction is that the motivation system gets hijacked, okay? And so rather than a person's thoughts and behaviors being directed towards something that it should be directed towards, family relationships, friends, work, it gets sidetracked, it gets distracted, and all of the motivation centers around acquiring and using the drug, okay? The limbic cortex, or the limbic system, is the surrounding part. Now this is part of the cortex, but it's a deeper part of the cortex. According to evolutionary theory, it would be an older part of the cerebral cortex. Okay, so this is sort of what we refer to as a border system. The word limbic literally means border. And what that means is, anatomically, it's at the border of the deeper brain structures and the cortex, but also in terms of consciousness, in terms of awareness, right? Our normal thought life, what we're aware of. The limbic system functions kind of in that twilight area where something is not maybe fully conscious, but it's partially conscious. And so two major structures here of the limbic system would be the hippocampus. The word actually literally means seahorse, and so if you go to an aquarium and you happen to be looking at the seahorses, look at the Latin term and you'll see hippocampus in there. It's shaped kind of like a seahorse, and the hippocampus is very critical for what we would call memory consolidation. And then the amygdala, which is real close there in the limbic system, is very important for emotional significance. Do a battery change. All right, and so again, if we go on to talk about addiction and maybe some of these pathological states different types of psychological disorders, we'll talk more about those structures. They're very, very important for psychiatry and also for psychology. So the cerebral cortex, the outermost part of the brain, is comprised of 4 lobes. They're named, each of these lobes is named for the cranial bone that is outside of it. And so I number them from the back to the front. I draw a little eye just to keep you oriented. And so you have the occipital lobe here at the very back of your skull. Okay, kind of above that and forward here, area number 2 is the parietal lobe. Below that, right behind your ears, is the temporal lobe of the brain. And then finally, number 4, the front part, behind your forehead and above the sockets of your eyes, would be the frontal lobe of the brain. The occipital lobe, will start back there. Sort of paradoxically, this is the visual part of the brain. This is where conscious vision, our experience of vision, begins to be constructed based upon neural activity, visual awareness. Humans are very visual. We have over 30 areas of our brain devoted to visual processing. Now, this would contrast with something like a rhesus macaque monkey, which would have only 9 areas devoted to vision. Dogs and cats would only have a few areas of their brains devoted to vision. But humans have 30 areas of the brain devoted to vision. Damage to the occipital lobe causes blindness. If you damage all of your primary visual cortex, not only will you become completely blind, you will no longer remember what it was like to experience vision. So very different from blindness that results from damage to the eyeballs or optic nerve. Okay, so finally, the parietal lobe behind that is involved with the sense of the body, our bodies in 3-dimensional space. It contains the somatosensory cortex. And so what this is, it's a map there on your cortex of your body. And so touch, whenever someone touches or you feel pain in your body, what that actually is resulting from is the neural activity, your awareness of that, of those signals there in the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. Okay. The temporal lobe, here denoted with T behind your ears on both sides, right? You can only draw one side, but it's on both sides. Contains the auditory cortex, the hearing part of the brain. The deep part of the temporal lobe is where you find the hippocampus and the amygdala of the limbic system. And then finally, we want to talk very quickly about the frontal lobe of the brain. Again, psychiatry and psychology hugely concerned with this frontal lobe of the brain. So in the frontal lobe, the border between the parietal and the frontal is the central sulcus, an indentation on the surface of the brain. But what you find is the primary motor cortex. And so this is a map of your body, and what happens is neurons here will signal movement in specific body parts. Like a very specific little field of neurons here in my primary motor cortex would cause me, for example, to move my index finger, right? Now backing up, going forward one step, we have what's called the premotor cortex. And the premotor cortex is involved with signaling sequences or patterns of movements. If you learn to play the piano or the guitar, what you're learning are those sequences. And as you become better, you're training your premotor cortex to send not just specific signals, but patterns of signals to your motor cortex and then down your spinal cord and out to your body. And finally, the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. What the PFC does, again, it's very, I put the psi here, from Greek, right? This is the area most of interest to psychiatry and psychology by far. But the PFC is involved in executive control. Think of it as the CEO, right? Or the president of the brain. It's the part of the brain that's involved with complex planning, behavioral planning, strategies, techniques, relational planning, but also, just as importantly, with the inhibition of behaviors that would be inappropriate or might lead to adverse negative consequences. And so, as you might expect, a lot of the pathology of things like personality disorders, antisocial personality disorders, behavioral disorders, addiction, will focus on deficient functioning here in the prefrontal cortex. Thank you very much.